Hello, my name is Matthew Hadodo. Thank you for joining me today for my presentation for this year's NWAV. Very excited to share some of my research on the Istanbul Greek community and their language. And as the title suggests, I'm presenting on specifically how word lists may be demonstrating the idea that the Istanbul Greek variety, even though it's a sigmatized variety, may be understood as a competing standard Greek variety. All right, so just to orient ourselves really briefly, for those of you who are not aware, this is a map of modern day Turkey, and Istanbul bridges the European and Asian continents. You may not realize that there is an indigenous Istanbul Greek population for the past few thousand years. It's not a homogenous group, but due to the geopolitical movements over the past centuries, and specifically throughout the 20th century, the population has dwindled. Now there's a growing diaspora throughout the rest of the Greek-speaking world and the rest of the world in general. And the dialect has been influenced by lots of other languages, lots of other dialects of Greek, and has had its own internal changes. There's been very little research done on the variety for a few different reasons. And the few times that it does tend to get mentioned, it's usually said, oh, it's not that different from Standard Modern Greek, as Kontasopoulos discusses. However, as a heritage speaker of the variety, doing my own research on the dialect, there have been multiple differences with Standard Modern Greek. Certain features found in Northern Greek varieties, as well as other peripheral dialects of Greek, certain archaisms, what could be understood as retentions of either Byzantine or older forms, lots of context-induced change, not only from Turkish, but from the other local languages spoken in Istanbul, and certain internal changes and other, perhaps not quite sure whether or not they're internal changes or other sorts of phenomena. But today I'm going to be focusing on specifically velarized laterals, which is something that happens in Northern Greek dialects. And it's very commonly associated with Istanbul Greek. It's what we would say it's indexical of Istanbul Greek in terms of how speakers discuss the variety. During my interviews with over 80 Istanbul Greek speakers over the course of 6 months spread over a few years, that is almost universally said to be a defining feature, even though it's found in other Greek dialects. And to a lesser extent, I found a few people mentioning this post-alveolar production for coronal affricates, which tend to be alveolar in Standard Greek. So tsa in Standard Greek versus cha in Istanbul Greek. To a lesser extent, not quite as salient in terms of how speakers discuss it, but as an important feature for the community at large. So my questions as I lay them out here are, well, if we have these two different features that differ slightly in salience based on, and we'll discuss possibly not just the phonetic divergence from Standard Greek, but also in terms of how speakers metapragmatically discuss these in parts of the larger Istanbul Greek community and language. Well, are speakers then going to shift to Standard Modern Greek, or will they maintain the Istanbul Greek variants? How will they pattern in word lists, the laterals and the affricates? Will they pattern similar to each other, differently from one another? And outside of word lists, are speakers going to be consistently producing them the same way, or are they going to be following an attention to speech model that others have seen elsewhere? And I'm also adding, what does the role of speakers' metapragmatic discourse have in terms of how the variation is patterning? So very briefly, attention to speech model has been around for the past several decades, starting with Labov and Trudgill in the 70s, and many others since then have shown that with this attention to speech model, that there's a variety of quote unquote speech styles where casual speech people tend to speak the more local variants, and then the more standard like speech is elicited in word lists. We've seen that in New York City and Norwich with different phonetic features, and many others have replicated those results in different communities. However, recently, Stuart Smith et al. And Gafter in 2016 also have shown that different communities are producing stigmatized variants in word lists, and there's different reasons for that. So Smith et al. Have shown that the role of the media possibly is helping promote certain reasons for the language change to happen that way. Gafter discusses how within specifically the Mizrahi Hebrew-speaking community, there's a different orientation to the pharyngeal consonants and how those are deemed to be prestigious, even though they're stigmatized in different ways for the community. And so these are sort of the frameworks that I'm working with and seeing where the Istanbul Greek community more or less will fall in line with those. Just to give a little bit of a description in terms of what I did with my research, I conducted critical ethnography, if you want to think of it in those terms. I was in Istanbul in 2016 and 2018 for a period of 6 months altogether. I also went to Athens one summer for about 6 weeks, and I interviewed 25 first-generation Istanbul Greeks that have moved there. But I'm focusing my data, focusing today's talk on the data I collected from my Istanbul Greek reference who currently reside there. In terms of the word list, in terms of what I had done and beyond the ethnography, in addition to participating in different local events, I interviewed 81 speakers in Istanbul, stratified across different ages and genders, and we can talk about that during the Q&A section if we have time, and if you're interested. And I had a section that was more narrative elicitation, you know, traditional sociolinguistic interview, modified. And I also had a word list, different photo elicitation tasks, different types of other elicitation tasks. What would you say in a certain situation? And then finally, I ended asking questions to elicit metapragmatic discussion. You know, are standard Greek better than Istanbul Greek, vice versa? How are they different from each other, and so on? And so from the word list that I'm presenting, specifically, I had in a list with over 60 items, 11 lateral segments and 12 affricate segments. Based on what was usable to do acoustic phonetic analysis using Pratt, I have 856 lateral tokens and 831 affricate tokens taken throughout the interviews. In terms of the lateral measurements, well, just briefly in terms of what velarization even is, it's the co-articulation of the tongue root approaching the velum, with the tongue tip and blade being more dentalized. And because it has to do with the place of articulation, the primary acoustic cue is F2, higher F2s being a more fronted or alveolar production, lower F2s being more velarized. And this happens in Istanbul Greek before back vowels. Standard Greek is pretty much similar to Spanish, where you have la, le, li, lo, lu, but Istanbul Greek has la, le, li, lo, lo, right? Northern Greek dialects also have this, as I mentioned. However, some preliminary research that Lokina has done in 2010 showed that the mean F2 of laterals before a in Southern Greek is about almost 1500 hertz, and in Northern Greek it's about 1324, whereas my data shows a more progressive velarization going on. In my case, it's before all back vowels, not just a. So here I'm showing you mean F2s, just to sort of orient ourselves. The higher than the F2, the higher to the top of the chart, the more standard-like it is, the clearer or alveolar the production. And then the closer to the bottom of the chart, the more of the Istanbul Greek velarized production. I don't have anything here with the front vowels, but I'm just showing you more or less how the patterns happen phonetically in terms of the phonetic constraints. We see before back vowels, about 1150 hertz. And in coda position, which hasn't been documented before, we see more means at about the standard modern Greek production, although we have quite a bit of variation to quite velarized forms. Okay. When we separate lateral production by gender and age, we see something interesting. We see that men are pretty consistently velarizing at about 1100 hertz again. Not much difference in terms of age, nothing significant at the statistical levels. In terms of gender, we're seeing a wider sort of error bars, specifically with the oldest females having quite the range of most standard-like and the most Istanbul-like lateral tokens. And then the youngest females are in fact at basically at standard Greek production levels. So that more or less corresponds with what we expect in a traditional attention to speech model, in the sense that the youngest females are leading this change, which we see time and again across linguistic research. But it is important to note that that's the only significant difference from the other women. All the other women are still at pretty velarized productions, but significantly distinct from the men. In terms of gender and network, which I determine in terms of how my Istanbul Greek speakers have either friends or family in Greece, whether they visit Greece frequently, if they have Greek satellite television, and so on and so forth. And what we see is that it really has more of a role for the men, in which my men participants who had the Greek social networks or more strong ties to Greece were definitely velarizing less than those with more Istanbul Greek networks. In terms of women, it seemed to have less of a role, wasn't significant from those with equal groups. And the Istanbul Greek oriented women definitely had lots of variation, but we see that with men, it's really the men with the Greek networks that were velarizing less. And again, when we look at social network and age, it's the youngest groups that are definitely leading this change. The Istanbul Greek oriented people, even with the youngest ones, are still velarizing more, but particularly with the Greek networks and the equal social networks, people are velarizing less, which makes sense. The oldest speakers tend not to see much of a difference, however. And then to sort of triangulate the data, in addition to what I had from the word list, I also am taking into consideration the last few questions of my interviews, which were asking speakers, well, do you believe that the varieties are different? And if so, how? And is one variety better or worse than another? And what I'm labeling ideologies are those who said that Istanbul Greek is better, Greek, standard modern Greek is better, or that there's no difference. So that's what ideology stands for. And in terms of stance, that was each participant's overarching way that they described the Istanbul Greek community as either being holistically different from standard Greek speakers, whether they were referencing cultural differences, sorts of values or practices in terms of, well, it doesn't matter if you're Greek from Greece or Cyprus or Turkey, we're all the same, versus, oh no, we're very specifically unique. And what we see is that in terms of language ideologies, there doesn't really seem to be, that doesn't seem to be playing a role for those who viewed Istanbul Greeks as being sort of categorically distinct as a different type of Greekness, all of whom had very much been velarizing, still lots of variation, but they have those mean F2s at a much lower level, as opposed to this that, oh no, all Greeks are the same, definitely velarizing less at much more standard Greek production frequencies. But also for them, that's where you have this amongst them, those who said, well, Istanbul Greek is a better variety, are definitely velarizing more than those that said standard Greek was better. And now moving on to affricate measurements. Basically, you can't look at F2 because those laterals are more vocalic, more vowel-like. Affricates, however, we can look at the fricative portion, as Gordon and all have discussed, and look at the center of gravity, which is basically where the largest distribution of the frication energy is. And in Standard Modern Greek, there is quite a variety of whether or not these affricates are alveolar or retracted alveolars. But recently, Themistokleos has shown that in Standard Modern Greek, the voiceless fricative has cog values around 7,000 hertz, and the voice variant being a little bit having lower hertz values. So this is at least a benchmark, since no one has done the study for Istanbul Greek before, but we're going to say around 7,000 hertz is what we expect for the fricative portion of the affricate. So when we look at the more linguistic restraints, in this case, I just said word initial versus word medial, we see much larger standard error bars. So there's much more variation happening with these affricates, which makes sense since even in standard Greek, there's quite a bit of variation. However, the mean cog values in this case is at around 5,000 hertz, which is still a bit lower than what we would expect in standard Greek at least. We do see some speakers producing those standard Greeks F2, or not F2 rather, the cog values, but there is quite a bit of discrepancy among speakers, quite a lot of variation. In terms of gender, we see something interesting. Men are not really being that different from each other across ages. They're all right around that mean 5,000 hertz bar value. With the women, however, we're seeing something interesting. Whereas if you recall from the laterals, the youngest women were much more likely to produce standard Greek alveolarized laterals. Here, they're much more likely to produce Istanbul Greek affricates. So they're more likely to have a post-alveolar production for whatever reason. And they're the only ones that are statistically significant from the other members of the group across ages for gender. When we look at gender network, in this case, both men and women are being influenced by the social networks much more. So those with Greek networks are much more likely to have more Standard Greek-like fronted alveolar affricate productions versus those with more Greek or neutral or equal standard social networks, which are more likely to produce post-alveolar productions. Network and age, again, we don't really see much of a difference, although it seems that those with Greek networks, the older you are, the more likely you are to produce. So this is a little counterproductive, but it makes some sense if you consider, well, if you're older and you have more time in Greece, then you're more likely to have been influenced and to produce a Standard Greek variant. And then along with the language ideologies and stance, what I'm calling stance holistically, again, what we're seeing with those who viewed all Greeks being the same or similar, that's the only time where the social network, or not social network rather, but the language ideologies are playing a role in differentiating affricate production. Those with different taking stances that Istanbul Greeks are distinct are definitely producing the variant more. It's not as extreme with the laterals, which makes sense if the laterals are more salient, both in terms of phonetic difference, but also in terms of the metapragmatic discourse that accompanies that. But they're still velarizing, or in this case, producing more post-alveolar production, a more backed production. So I'm now going to spend the last few minutes showing some speakers using their knowledge or metapragmatic awareness to do different things with these sounds, both in and out of the word lists, right? So here we have an older male speaker, was born in 1939, lived 20 some odd years in Greece before returning to Istanbul. I present him with the word list, and this is what he says to me.
Είναι από ανάλογο.
Όχι, μόνο...
Είναι από ανάλογο.
Όπως...
Ανάλογο, βαλίτσες, βάλουμε, βάρκα.
So what's curious here is that this speaker, even though I just asked him to recite the word list, and then he says, well, what should I say? Analogo, which means accordingly, or analogo. So he starts off with a stylized performance of Istanbul Greek, both in terms of the laterals, which you can see that the F2 is much, much lower. It's actually at 760 hertz here. And then he jumps up to 1259 hertz for the second one. Snell would say it's a stylized performance in terms of pitch, loudness. And then once he recites the final, doing the actual word list, his F2 goes up to 1304 hertz. So not quite what we expect at Standard Greek, but definitely much more alveolar than what we expect in Istanbul Greek. And it's curious because he's doing this performance because he possibly thinks, oh, I know, even though I don't necessarily know all the things that you're looking for, you're a linguist, I know what this is an important thing. However, if you could hear, he also said valiches for suitcases, not valitzes. So he was attending to the laterals in this sort of performance of a Standard Greek or Istanbul Greek kind of a thing. Now we have this one participant who was doing fairly, she's a university professor, was producing fairly somewhat standard-like, definitely not super velarized laterals, usually between 12 and 1300 hertz. And the word list here, she's in the 1400 range. And here she's saying the word kalo, which means good.
Kalanda, kala, kale, kali, kalo, kalus.
So when she says kalo, her midpoint F2 of that lateral is at 1420 hertz. And then in a spontaneous speech, when she was responding to me talking about something from Istanbul, one of the words in the language, portemonnaie for wallet, as opposed to standard portefeuille, or that's Turkish actually, portofoli, she says,
Γιατί το portemonnaie σου πρέπει να έχεις...
And that midpoint F2 is at 1154 hertz, right? And so that's maybe more in line with what Becker has said in terms of New York City speakers, going into those dialectal features when they're talking about the dialect. I'm almost out of time, but I want to share at least a portion of this where we have a performance of standard modern Greek rather than Istanbul Greek. So I'll at least play a portion of this recording.
Διαφέρει πολύ αυτό. Τα ελληνικά της Κωνσταντινούπολης είναι διαφορετικά, τα ελληνικά των Ελλήνων είναι πολύ διαφορετικά. Τώρα εκεί πέρα, έλα, εγώ τώρα παίρνω στην εξαδέλφη μου πρώτη φορά στην αγορά, την ανοίγω στο τηλέφωνο και τη λέω, έλα, με λέει.
So I'm going to end it there just for interest of time. But here, Mr. Yanni, who's reciting the story in reference to one of my questions of how are the dialects different from each other. And even though he was talking about politeness and different sorts of communicative strategies, he's doing a performance of Standard Greek, not only with those sorts of discourse things, but also with the laterals. So he was the 8th most velarizing speaker in terms of the word list, with the mean F2 of about 1,000 hertz before both back vowels and the codas, in coda position. When he's performing Standard Greek and he says "ela," which means come, his mean F2 jumps up to, midpoint F2 jumps up to 1,595 hertz, almost 1,600 hertz. And then when he says, when he's not performing, he says, when I went to Greece, "elava," it goes down to 825 hertz. So we're seeing this sort of stylistic difference, and also not just the performance of Istanbul Greek like the one speaker did who has lived in Greece. This speaker who has lived in Istanbul his whole life is performing Standard Greek as being, you know, the aberrant one. And over time, so I don't have time to go over this other speaker who is a younger woman who's about in her late 20s, but I just wanted to say that what she does is, you know, doesn't think she has much of an accent. She doesn't think that she uses this lateral in that way. And there is a little bit of a difference. She definitely velarizes more outside of the word list than she does inside, and I don't have time to talk about it. But what's also important from both Yanni's as well as this speaker's metapragmatic discourse, and maybe you can pause this if we don't have time, I can talk about it more during the Q&A section, is that there's these holistic evaluations of things that they don't like about Standard Greek, such as, you know, him thinking that it's mocking, it's not sincere, that Istanbul is nicer, and here the attribution of certain other dialectal features as being villager style, and Istanbul Greek says not having those sorts of features. So in conclusion, with wordless laterals, we see that only the young women are kind of patterning as we expect based on an attention to speech model with regard to standard language use. The social networks seem to be playing a larger role for younger men in terms of a clearer lateral. And in terms of the language ideologies, that really is only seeming to matter for those who think that all Greeks are the same, as opposed to those who are viewing Istanbul Greeks as being a distinct community. In terms of affricates, it's a bit almost the opposite in the sense that young women are producing of the more Istanbul Greek features, which I'm not 100% sure why yet. I think that just might be a lack of exposure, since social networks seem to be much more powerful of a predictor in terms of adopting the Standard Greek form, which makes sense because if the laterals are super salient in an index of Istanbul Greekness, but the affricates are not, then that makes sense why certain things may be shifting more readily as opposed to those who want to sort of defend their Istanbul Greekness. And again, the language ideologies are playing less of a role for those who view Istanbul as being sort of their own kind of community. And then finally, in terms of social meaning, well, I mean, first of all, women are really attending to speech in the word list, but then their conversation casual speech is definitely more of the Istanbul Greek variant versus men who are pretty consistent throughout, whether it's in the word list or not, unless they're doing some kind of a performance. And also the metapragmatic discourses circulating ideologies about the language variation and the users of the language. And I think that's what's playing a really big role in terms of how Istanbul Greeks are viewing Istanbul Greek as a competing standard variety, in part because of Istanbul's historical legacy. So moving forward, I have a lot of things that I want to do, certain things that I'm already working on. I'm out of time, so I appreciate your patience with me. And thank you for attending this session, for listening or watching on your spare time. And a lot of people to thank, so I'm going to leave this here. And I look forward if any of you have any questions for the Q&A session on, I believe, the 22nd. So thank you very much and have a great day.